hope we're doing well. This is going to be our deep edging Photoshop tutorial. It's been a very long day, so I apologize if my energy fluctuates as we go, but I'm going to do my best to keep it constant and entertaining as we dive into what is a very tedious, time-consuming process, but once you get the sort of thought process down, it's quite easy to sort of just sit down, listen to some music and get it done. And as I stressed in class, as I'll continue to stress to you guys, the more effort we put into it now, the easier and better our animation is going to be later down the line. All right, so just an introduction to Photoshop, just to briefly jog your memories if you weren't in class for whatever reason. Opening up Photoshop, we are now looking at our home page. We're going to be taking a look at photo manipulation, so that's going to be cutting up pieces of photos that we import into Photoshop and then separating those into their own layers and animating in After Effects. So we're not going to be learning how to paint things. This isn't a concept art tutorial, so don't get your hopes set up on that. But you can obviously move over to the learning page of Photoshop if you'd like to dive into more detail in further tutorials, moving beyond the realms of what I'll be covering in our term at the end of the year. All right, so starting off at home, we're going to click on the Create New button. This opens up our new document panel. And as with all software, we are going to be going to the Film and Video preset panel, and we're going to grab the HDTV 1080p preset. This is going to be a full HD layout, which means that our workspace in Photoshop will be the same size as it is in After Effects, and that's going to then allow us to simply import our file, plug and play, without having to worry about scaling things later. Now, some things to change on the side here. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to relabel or change the name of our file now, so we don't have to do it later. And we're going to stick with the naming convention of Assignment 1 Assets today. All right, height and width are already set. Orientation format, that's fine. Resolution and the color mode and all that, we're going to leave as it is. What is going to be changed, however, is the background contents. Right now it's set to white, no issue with that. However, because we're going to be cutting out information, it actually helps us to be able to see through any gaps that we might accidentally create. Because we're working with an image that has both light and dark areas, so a fairly high contrast image, we're going to just set ours to transparent. And that way we'll see that checkerboard sort of pattern shining through any gaps that we make along the way. Okay, so with that done, we don't need to worry about the advanced options. We just say create and we're in. All right, so in our viewing panel, we've already kind of set up our layers and everything when we were in class, but just to go through that one more time, if we go over to Window, we can obviously still go to Workspace. I enjoy using the Graphic and Web preset, and I'll just reset that there so that we're kind of looking at the same thing to begin with. In the center of our screen is our workspace. We can see this checkerboard pattern taking control of the panel here. And we then have our tools on the left. We're going to be making use of the Move tool to kind of just move our layers around if we need to. Our selection tools, which are very important, mostly the Lasso tool. The Brush tool, which we'll use when we start making our masks. And then just the color panel options down here at the bottom. So I won't talk your ear off about these. You can obviously find a more detailed tutorial on Photoshop if you need to. Coming on over to the right hand side, we've got all of our panels. We don't need character, paragraph or glyph, so I can just click on my little hamburger button here and select close tab. We don't need properties, library or layer comps either, so we can close those as well. And that leaves us with our layer panel. Now, the biggest difference between our layers in Photoshop and Illustrator is that Illustrator is a vector-based software. So you guys will remember when we were working on that last term that whatever we made, we could scale it up as big as we wanted or as small as we wanted, and we were always guaranteed a nice crisp image. In Photoshop, however, we work with rasterized graphics, which essentially locks the visual information in place. If we scale it up beyond 100%, it's going to pixelate. If we scale it down and then up, we're going to lose information. So we need to treat our layers accordingly. Another big difference is that Photoshop does not have a main layer, sub-layer setup like Illustrator does. We're going to be working on individual layers. We're going to label them accordingly, and we're just going to make sure, and I'll show along the way, how we can flatten or combine individual layers so that we essentially group them together on a single layer, multiple layers within a single file kind of thing. All right, let's bring in the files that we've downloaded from Canvas. So we're going to come on up to File, and we're going to select Place Embedded. remembering that when we place something embedded, we are taking that information and placing it inside of Photoshop. So that's going to increase our file size, but it guarantees that whenever I take that file off of this machine onto another one on campus perhaps, my image is already inside Photoshop. I don't have to worry about having forgotten the image at home and then my link is broken and then it's a nightmare all around. Okay, so we're going to select Place Embedded and we're going to grab our images that we've downloaded from Canvas. Let's take the very first one and we're just going to leave these settings as they are and say Place. Now, when we say place, it fills the page. Our image is the same size as the workspace. That works out quite well. But you'll notice that you can't deselect, and that's because we haven't finished the placing sort of step. We need to hit Enter in order to lock this in place. So if this was a smaller file, I could obviously use this as an opportunity to scale it up and down or move it around as necessary. If I hover out over the edge and click and drag, it'll rotate it. But I need to hit Enter in order to lock it in place. All right, and then obviously just when I select it with my move tool, that brings up my options for changing its scale and things like that, but we don't need to stress about that at the moment. Let's bring in our guides file as well. So we're going to go File, Place, Embedded, and grab our second image, and we're going to say Place and hit Enter, and they're just going to sit on top of each other like that. Okay. Coming on over to the Layers tab, just to walk through what's changed here. We now have two layers. I just called them 1 and 2, so we'll leave them like that for now. And we've got their thumbnails that we have visible to us. Now, the thumbnails in Photoshop are very important because they actually give a lot of meta or small pieces of information that someone who's not familiar with the software won't know to look out for. We also can see that when we select our layer, the thumbnail gets a little white border around it. And this becomes important later when we apply a mask, because we can then select and work on top of different thumbnails, which can be a little bit confusing and frustrating at times, but that's the way that it is, and we just need to adapt, I'm afraid. Okay, so our goal for this exercise is to prepare this file for animation. Now, our guide image shows us some red outlines, and each of these assets that have been outlined in red are going to end up on their own layers. The only thing that is not outlined in red, but should be outlined in red, is this plant here in front. So please write it down, make a note. This plant, just as itself, doesn't need to be individual branches or leaves or anything like that, but just this plant needs to be on its own layer as well. I'll make sure to remind you of that when I get there myself in this tutorial. Okay, so I've explained in class that the point of a parallax is to take a single point perspective image that provides a lot of visual depth staggered out as it progresses into the distance. In this image, we have a lot of visual planes where we can see that there's sort of like rolling hills and information's being lost as they overlap. And our goal is to find those overlapping pieces of information and cut out these layers onto their own, or cut out these assets rather onto their own layers. We then need to deep edge them, which is the process of softening their edges so that they look as though they exist within a space. If they have very sharp cut-out edges, it looks very fake, as though we've just cut it out of a magazine and pasted it on a page kind of thing. We also then need to paint in information. So as we're cutting out these pieces over here, that's going to then obviously remove information from them. When they overlap and we have them sliding over each other in After Effects for our animation, visual gaps become apparent. And that's also a fantastic way to ruin a parallax animation. So we got to paint that information in using the clone stamp tool as well as the healing brush tools in order to allow us to just make it look as though it's more realistic still. And once those layers are prepped and set, we import them into After Effects and we make them move from there. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to group our two original images. It's always a good idea to keep the original images that we're bringing in as backups so that if we screw the pooch later down the line, we don't have to re-import anything. We haven't destroyed our original image. We simply just make a duplicate of it and we fix what we need to. Okay, so with our two layers selected, we can either just select the top one and holding down Command or Shift and clicking on the one below it. We can click on the new group button at the bottom of the layers panel. All right, so by clicking on this new group button over here, creates a group and places the selected layers inside of it. We're going to call this group OG. It's just a naming convention I've had for years now, the original gangster images, so that we know not to mess with these. Okay, The next thing we're then going to do is we are going to grab the first layer, so the layer that does not have red outlines on it, and we're going to duplicate this layer. To do that, we can either right click and select duplicate. That opens up our duplicate window, and we can change the name of it here and say OK. Alternatively, we simply hit Command or Control J, and that makes a copy for us. All right. Now we're going to drag this image outside of the group. So simply by, if I undo that move quickly, simply by clicking and dragging to the very bottom of the layer stack, it's now outside of our group. We can turn on our reference footage, and now we can turn off our folder, which sort of contains our guides, and we can then very easily just refer back to that. Okay. Now we've got this copy that we've made, and we're raring and ready to get in to start making duplications and selections and things. However, we first need to rasterize this image. Right now it is a smart object. We can see that by this little icon sitting over the thumbnail in the layer tab. And a smart object, as far as I understand it, is essentially a safe mode for the image. It guarantees that no information is going to be lost, so I can scale this all the way down and hit enter, scale it all the way back up and hit enter, and I don't lose any information. It retains itself. However, because it's so busy retaining itself, we can't actually edit the image. If I wanted to hit B for brush, for example, you'll see that I can't draw on the image. It gives me a little no access marker. And as soon as I click on it, it tells me that I have to rasterize this image in order for us to actually work with it. So in order to rasterize my layer, I can simply just right click on the layer. I'm going to come down to about the halfway point, and we're going to select rasterize layer. As soon as we do that, the smart object icon disappears, and now I can paint on top of it to my heart's content. All right. We aren't going to be painting over it, however. We are going to be using our selection tools, and we're going to start then setting this up so that we can get these onto their own layers. Now, the process that we follow is going to be the same for every layer. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through step by step for this bottom portion down here, as well as this little portion here, just to introduce the concepts that we're going to be following. And then I'm going to do the entire image and kind of just speed up the playback for you guys so you're not sitting and watching for about 4 hours while I do this. And I'll then just add comments along the way if necessary. I'll also show how to do the clouds as well as how to do one of these background mountains so that you can see how to go about filling in the space. And then you'll just sort of speed through the video and apply the same methodology that I do for the piece. Okay, let's start off with by just renaming our rasterized copy layer over here. We're going to call this edit, and that way we'll know that this is what we're going to be working on. And we can in fact just grab our folder, that's our OG layers folder here, and I'm going to bring its opacity down to about 50%. So our opacity option for the layer is at the top of the layer tab, and I'm going to lock that folder. So I can still turn it on and off, but I can't accidentally draw on top of it, and I can't accidentally move it. What I moved there was actually my edit image below it, which is fine. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to do is we are going to grab our Lasso tool. Now, the Lasso tool is essentially a freehand selection tool. Click and drag, and that then creates our selection. By default, I recommend once you've selected the Lasso tool, come up to the top left and change its setting to the Add to Selection option. So that's the second one over here. This will allow me to draw my initial selection, and then anything that I draw after that will automatically be added to my selection as opposed to overwriting the selection. All right, and what I recommend doing is kind of just having the OG folder on so I can see these guides, and I'm just going to do a very rough selection to begin with, just to get a majority of the information selected. I'm literally just clicking and dragging, and when I release, it closes that shape. All right, I then need to remember to also select the information down here in the bottom corner. We have to be fully involved with the selection. Unfortunately, there's no way that Photoshop's going to know to select things to the left or the right if they have the same color tone, etc. We could use the quick selection tool, but we're going to get to that a little bit later when the information is a little bit easier for the software to read. Okay, So now that I've got my initial selection, what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn off the visibility for my OG folder. And that's going to allow me to now actually see where my edges are. And we're going to zoom in. You guys are going to get used to looking at pixel depth like this. And we're going to add to our selection following that visual contour. Okay, feel free to zoom in and out because sometimes the eye gets confused and we don't know where one sort of line ends and the other begins. But we want to then spend time getting an absolute or as accurate a selection as possible. Alright, so I've got my basic selection done. If I take too much information, so here for example I think there's a bit of a dip that I've accidentally selected, we can always come back up to the top left of the screen and grab the subtract from selection option. And you'll see there's now a little minus next to my lasso, and when I click and drag, whatever's inside the selection that I select there is going to be removed from the overall selection. Now the more time and effort that I put into these selections, the less effort I need to do later. So I do recommend spending more time on this than I'm going to be spending in the tutorial. I obviously want to keep this as succinct as possible, but yeah, do realize that the more effort you put in now, the less retouching work you're going to have to do later. All right, so we've got our selection. We can now tell by these marching ants that we've selected now this bottom left-hand corner, and the next step is to place this image or this piece of information on its own layer. In order to do that, with our selection tool selected, we're simply going to right-click anywhere inside of these marching ants. The very first option is deselect, so if you ever find yourself having made a selection you're not happy with, just right-click and hit deselect. We're going to go for layer via cut. It's a very destructive method, but we don't have to worry because we have got the original image still in our folder, so we can cut this one up as much as we like. We don't have to worry about re-importing it later down the line. So we're going to select layer via cut, and that's then going to create layer 1, and it's going to put that piece of information on that layer. See how now having that checkerboard in the background becomes quite useful. Okay. So in order to walk you through the steps, I'm then going to just move on to the next little portion of shrubbery that we have here. So I'm going to turn my guides back on and just make my rough selection here and refine that selection afterwards. Okay, and that little piece over there. Cool. So we've now got our second little portion that looks like something I should select as well. And once again, making sure that we've got our edit layer selected. This is also something that's very important. We need to make sure that when we're working with our selections, when we're cutting this information out, we're putting them, or rather we have the correct layer selected when we're cutting that information. All right, so with the edit layer selected, our outlines are now existing. We're going to right click and say layer via cut as well, and that's going to make a second layer here. Okay, so we've now got these two. We're just going to rename these. I'm going to call the very first one 1, I'm going to call the second one 2, and that way you'll know what I'm talking about when I say what to do where. Okay, so my personal work method is I would go through and select everything. What I'm going to do rather is I'm going to focus on just these two bottom pieces that we have available here, show you what to do with that information, and then I'll do a speed run of selecting and deep edging everything else so you can kind of just see how I do those assets. But it's the same process. That's my point. It's very tedious, it's very boring for some people, but it's very easy to do. Whatever we do for the one, we'll do for the other. Okay, so with that now said, I'm going to turn off my guides, I'm going to turn off my edit layer, and I'm going to turn off layer 2. I'm just going to focus on layer 1 for now. And the next step is the actual deep edging process. Now, there are a number of ways to do this, but the method we're going to be using is we're going to apply a mask to this layer, and then we're going to paint information out so that we can soften these edges. In order to apply a mask, we're going to come on down to the bottom right corner of the screen, and there's this little Japanese looking flag at the bottom here, piece of paper with a black hole cut out of the middle of it. And with my layer 1 selected, clicking on that add mask layer is going to add a second little thumbnail to our layer. Now notice how that thumbnail has the little white border showing that it is selected. If I click on my original image, then it gets selected. So what I do on the one is not going to necessarily affect the other. So it's very important to pay attention to what you're working on top of. Now, with the mask selected, we're going to hit B for brush, and that is then going to give us our brush tool. And we're going to come on up to the top left of the screen to our brush options. We can bring our size up to about 25 or so. I think 20 will work. But please bring your hardness down to 0. I know we used 10 in class, but we can use 0 for the tutorial. Okay. What I'm then also going to do is just come over to opacity. That's up here at the top as well, and I'm going to make that up to 100%. And I'm going to kind of be speeding through this, as I said, to keep this as succinct as possible. But you'll notice sometimes, if you keep an eye on my opacity, that I'm going to drop this down, especially when it gets to the more technical areas. And I'll explain why in a moment. Okay, so with the brush tool selected and with our mask selected, we'll now see that our colors are black and white. Regardless of what colors they were originally, for the mask, they will be black and white. Now, the black color information allows me to cover up information. I haven't deleted it, it's still there, it's just not visible to us right now. If I hit X on the keyboard, I can then paint it back in with the white brush. So black makes it disappear, white makes it reveal. Okay, with that concept now down, we're going to make sure that our front color is set to black. We're going to zoom in, get right up in there to about 2,500%. You guys are going to have to do this and get used to it. So like I said, start gritting the teeth now. And I'm literally just going to click and drag my brush along the edge of this asset. And my goal is to get these nice soft edges. So we want the edges to be super blurry. Now we can definitely go too far. We can definitely take out more information than is necessary. And that at least can be counteracted by painting it back in with the white color. But something to watch out for is rushing this. As I've said, I'm doing it quite quickly, but I would expect you guys to take a good couple of hours to get this file done in order to get it done properly. Always a good idea to do it better than your lecturer than the other way around. Okay, so I've been using 100% opacity up to this point, and it's been working because these edges are relatively uniform. They kind of just flow downhill. Here, however, it becomes a little bit more of a mission to work with. I'd need to make my brush smaller by using my square bracket keys. And as soon as I do that, I don't have the same kind of feather spread that I do when it's quite large. So that's when we bring our opacity down. I like to bring it down to about 48, 50%, and do a couple of passes over these areas. So we're kind of just clicking and dragging and clicking and dragging. And if we remove too much, we can always paint it back in. But for these more complex areas, this is the kind of minute handling that we need to adopt. Okay, and that's our first layer roughly deep edged. So when I come back in here and soften this up a little more even. And it's okay if we get rid of some of the information. Look, we're not going to be that zoomed in when we're working with this file, but we don't want to lose too much of it if we can help it. All right, so this is looking a lot nicer. These black spots over here are bugging me a little bit, so I'm just going to soften them up slightly. There we go. Okay, so we've now got our first layer selected. Now what we need to do is we need to consider the fact that our layers are going to be moving in space. So if I kind of just move this out of the way here, even though we've deep edged the sort of forward side that we're going to see, this information just ends. And if we manipulate these layers wrong, we could find that we suffer for it a little bit later. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move this layer slightly up and out the way here. I'm going to make sure that I select the main layer box over here. All right. Then I'm going to hit S for the clone stamp tool. We saw this in class, but the clone stamp tool allows us to hold down Option or Alt. That gives us this little crosshair over here. And we can then click to select visual information. Then wherever I move my brush, or the clone stamp tool in this case, which can also be increased or decreased in size depending on how big or large we want that information to be. And then just click and drag, and I'm just very roughly going to fill in this information here. Now, once again, the more effort that I put into this, the better. Holding down Option or Alt, clicking down here maybe, and just grabbing this information here. But for the sake of brevity, I'm not going to take too long to do it. We just want to fill in that corner over there. Okay, so we've only extended it a little bit, but that little bit can make a big difference later down the line. The next thing that we need to do now is we need to just fix the fact that we can see some duplicates occurring. Right, so there's like a repetition of pattern over here that's happening that becomes very clear that this was clone stamped. So what we're going to do next is hit J, and that brings up our Spot Healing Brush tool. Now the Spot Healing Brush tool is quite fantastic. I can quite literally just click and paint in an area, and Photoshop is going to sample the information and try and blend it together, pretty much getting rid of the information that I don't want. There's something like that there, and maybe that one there. Now, when I get too close to the edges, that becomes a problem. You'll see that because there's no information, it's painting it in white. But that's perfectly fine, because we're just going to then reselect our mask. We're going to hit B for brush, and I'm going to bring my opacity back up to 100%. And I'm just going to paint out that information like so. Maybe not too much down there, but something like that should be fine. You can then zoom in and just make sure to deep edge the information that I added at the top. That becomes very apparent if we don't do that. So we do need to remember to just take that final step there, and we can put this back in its place. Okay. Bringing out image 2 next. So if we take a look here, our original file has actually grown in size. I'm just going to put it back to its original position there. And what we can now do is work on our second little layer here. So I'm going to turn off layer 1, select layer 2, and apply a mask to it. B for brush, and I'm just going to zoom in and soften up these edges as best I can. Bringing my opacity down for these more complex areas. And that's going to let me do a couple of passes over them without completely removing the information as I go. It just gives me a little bit more level of control there. Something like that. Okay, so we've softened those edges. Let's now paint in some information. We need to remember to click on our image thumbnail. Then we can hit S for the clone stamp tool. I'm going to bring the size of this down slightly and just sample some information from here and paint it in. It's always good to overshoot with information. We can always do more with too much information than we can with too little. So I'm just going to put in about that much of an extension. I can always check how much it overlaps when I turn my layer 1 back on. Hit J for my healing brush tool and just fix up these areas over here, like so. And we don't need to worry about deep edging this portion of it here because we're not going to reveal that at any point. If this becomes visible, the illusion would break anyway. So we're not going to spend time deep edging portions that won't be visible. Just use this healing brush tool a little bit more there. Okay. And that then gives us our 2 layers prepped and ready. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to work on the rest of our image. Let me actually just turn off these layers and show you what's left. So I'm going to work on all the mountains. I'm going to do all the selections, get everything onto their own layers, and then I can go and work on masking them and painting in information. So I'll see you guys on the other side. Alright, so what we are left with now is we've got 15 layers in total, if we rename our edit layer to 15. And going through them from the top, we've got our very first grassy knoll in the bottom left, followed by the smaller little piece that we did at the beginning. We then have pieces of mountain as we go. And then what I want to show you now is actually this piece here. So remember at the beginning of the video I said the plant needs to be on its own layer. Now I did this on purpose just to show you the importance of having the correct layer selected when you're working on deep edging or selecting these pieces of information. So I'm going to have my layer 7 selected, and I'm just going to very quickly create a selection around the plant. Alright, so with this selection now done, I need layer 7 selected. In fact, we're just going to have the cloud involved in this as well. We won't get too nitty gritty there. I'm just going to right click and say layer via cut. And I'm just going to call this plant because I don't feel like renaming all the other layers. But obviously now we need to paint this information in behind it. The last one that we're going to do like that as well is this one here in the background. There it is there. So on my layer 13, there's this cloud over here that also wasn't outlined. I apologize for that. So we're going to make a quick cloud selection here and put this onto its own layer as well. Call that cloud, and now we've got all of our layers laid out. Okay, so I've got everything now separated. Now's the time to then start deep edging and then to start painting in the information. So exactly as we did for these, that's going to involve zooming in very close, painting out the edges after we've applied masks to each of our layers, and then obviously coming into where that information overlaps. Here's a prime example here, and extending the information so that we don't have any areas that have these solid gaps in the middle. All right, so I'm going to do that quietly. There's no real explanation that needs to be done. Just sit and graft, and if you get stuck on a particular asset, maybe just skip ahead so you can see how I manage that. And yeah, I'll see you on the other side. Alright, so I'm going to tackle the clouds next and kind of just show you what I'm thinking of doing when recreating this cloud here to the left. I'll probably do the same for the rest of them. So rather than trying to paint this in using a clone stamp tool, we can make use of the fact that clouds are fairly amorphous. So what I'm actually going to do here is I'm going to grab my cloud layer and I'm going to duplicate it. So I'm going to hit Command or Control J, and that's then going to duplicate my cloud. And if I hit V for my move tool, I can then just drag that over here. I'm going to right click on the layer, or sorry, I'm not. I'm going to click on it to select it, and then I'm going to hit Command or Control T. That's T for transform. And now if I right click on the layer, I can then come on over to flip vertical. That's going to flip it upside down like that. And I'm just going to change its rotation slightly like so. And I'm literally just going to build a little bit of a cloud over here. So I'm going to do something like that. I'm going to move my copy to sit below the original because we're going to see the original more. And then I'm going to mesh these two or join these two layers together. So in order to do that, I'm going to select both of the cloud layers here. I'm going to right click and I am going to then find the option for merge layers. Do not say merge visible. That's going to take all the layers that are visible and merge them into one. Do not say flatten image because that's going to merge all your layers into one. Only select the merge layers option so that it merges those two together. And then I can just grab my healing brush tool and flesh out the information here a little bit. I'm obviously going quite fast in comparison to what hopefully you guys will be doing, but I can blend this information together a little bit over here and then just deep edge the entire cloud. Right, so I'm going to do that for all of the other clouds if I can. This one I can definitely kind of duplicate and bring down and just make use of it there. So use your imagination and I'm sure you'll figure it out. All right, so technically I can call this image done. I am going to be perfectly honest, it's getting late and I have been rushing just to get this tutorial out to you guys. This took me, I would say, about, what time did I start? Maybe 7, so let's say 2 hours. This should take you about a week. So I do expect the work to look a little bit better. I know that I rushed through it, but it's using the same principle that we've done throughout, just copying and pasting information, painting it in where necessary, and painting it out when necessary. If you get stuck along the way, you can always jump onto YouTube and look at other tutorials when it comes to duplicating layers, flipping information, things like that. Otherwise, feel free to drop me an email and we can book a contact session to take a look at it, and we'll move forward from there. So like I said, this was very rushed. Your work should look a lot better than mine if you put the time and effort into it. So please do that. And then the last thing that we'll do is just rename our layers. So just label them as something that you understand. It's not something that you need to really be able to follow along with me. So I'm just going to rename these from 1 all the way down to my final layer, just so that they're all in descending numerical order. And we'll take a look at importing this into Photoshop, After Effects next week, and to start animating from there. Next week, we're also going to take a look at how to go about jumping back and forth between After Effects and Photoshop in order to fix any issues or gaps in information that we might have left along the way. Okay, so a little rushed, a little rough, but that's fine. This is the smallest assignment of the term after all, so we can kind of get away with just learning the ropes as we go and then really putting in effort and refinement into our final assignment. Okay, so I'll see you guys in the next one. Ciao.